That night, the Red Hollow Saloon was thick with the stink of liquor and sweat, like every misery in that dusty town had settled into the heavy air, and the crude laughter echoing through it. Under the dim lantern glow, men leaned against timber beams, tin cups in hand, eyes fixed on what passed for evening entertainment, an unofficial auction, no rules, no mercy, and certainly trace of decency. The saloon doors swung open, letting in the night wind, and a figure dragged across the warped floorboards, a young woman, hair-tangled dress, stained with dirt, hands bound behind her with coarse rope. But what silenced the room for a beat wasn't the rough way she'd been hauled in. It was the way she stood up, proud chin-lifted eyes, sharp as steel. They called her Tessa. And though her body was worn and her dignity bruised, she still held on to something no one could touch her spirit. Hank McCord, a bloated, drunken ranch boss, swayed atop a wooden table, raising his drink like a trophy. His voice rasped through the haze. "This girl can't cook, won't bow. Got a tongue like a blade. Dared to humiliate me in front of my own hands. Whoever thinks they can break her, be my guest. She's cheap tonight." Laughter erupted, raw, hungry, cruel. Someone hollered, "Wild mare, that one. Who's man enough to climb on and ride?" But Tessa didn't blink. Even with her hands tied, even with blood trickling down her cheek from Hank's slap, she stood her ground, rubbing the wound with a torn sleeve. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stared straight at the man who hit her and said, voice unwavering, "You're the kind of man who can't teach anyone a damn thing, not even yourself." It hit the room like a whip crack. Laughter died. Silence rolled in thick and tight. From a shadowed corner of the saloon, a man stood. No one had noticed him before. Bo Dillon, the quiet rancher with a limp, stepped forward, leaning on a worn wooden cane, eyes catching the dim light. No one called his name. They didn't have to. His presence shifted the air. The laughter shrank. The stares locked onto him. Bo didn't speak much. Just one question voice, low and steady, "How much?" The crowd froze. Hank let out a crooked laugh, mocking the man who limped. A crippled loner thinking he can ride the wild one. Hell, but Bo didn't answer. He reached to his belt, pulled out a weathered leather pouch, and laid down a handful of silver coins with a quiet clink that echoed across the wooden table. "I'm not looking for someone easy to command," he said. "I'm looking for someone who still carries fire." This time, the silence held. Not out of shock, but respect. Bo stepped forward and carefully cut the ropes. Tessa looked at him, not sure if it was pity or grace she felt, but in that man she saw something no one had ever offered her: equality. He didn't bark orders, didn't say her name, didn't ask questions. He just helped her to her feet gently, like lifting a horse caught in a trap, not dragging property back to its pen. They walked out of the saloon together. No one stopped them. The looks that followed were confused, uncertain, and strangely quiet. Tessa didn't say thank you. Bo didn't ask her to. But when the saloon doors closed behind them, when the night wind swept through her hair, and his stride remained slow, but sure something shifted. In the darkness of humiliation, a tiny light had sparked. Not dazzling, not bright, but warm enough that she no longer felt like a thing for sale. She felt seen, truly seen, as what she'd always been, a fire that no one, no matter how cruel, had ever managed to put out. Bo Dillon's ranch wasn't big, wasn't pretty, and sure as hell wasn't full of much except sky wide enough to steal your breath and a silence so deep it scraped the edge of your soul. When the creaking wagon rolled to a stop under the evening light, Tessa didn't say a word. She didn't look at the man who'd pulled her out of the saloon either. Her grip tightened around the reins, eyes locked on the weathered roof of the cabin ahead, as if she stared long enough the house might reveal something about the place. Or maybe about herself. Bo climbed down, with his familiar limp wooden cane tapping against the dry dirt. He turned, held out his hand, a quiet invitation. Tessa didn't take it. She jumped down on her own spine-straight eyes, still on the porch. It wasn't defiance, it was survival. Because in her world, nothing given came without a price. Inside the cabin was small clean. The air held the scent of pine-cold ash and worn leather. Bo gestured toward the loft. Beds made, towels by the basin. Then he turned and walked away. The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone with a silence so unfamiliar it made her forget how to breathe. No shouting, no keys turning in a lock, no plates breaking in anger, just stillness. That first night Tessa didn't sleep. She lay stiff on the firm mattress, hands folded behind her head, eyes fixed on the rough beams above. Below she heard the horses shifting in their stalls, the wind slipping through the cracks, and Bo's uneven footsteps pacing near the stove. No one hovered outside her door. No one barked commands. But still she couldn't relax. Not yet. Her heart was like drought-hardened ground, dry, cracked, wary of every drop. The next morning, before the sky even broke into light, Tessa was up and out. No one told her to. She just couldn't sit still in a place she didn't yet understand. She drew water from the well, started a fire, swept the porch. When Bo opened the door, the scent of coffee floated on the breeze. He didn't speak at first, just leaned against the frame, watching her rub down a saddle with bare hands, old scars, rough and dry across her knuckles like frost-bitten earth. Then he stepped forward. No scolding, no suspicion in his eyes. He simply set something down on the railing beside her, a pair of old leather gloves, soft-worn, thin, perfectly sized for her small hands. "Don't act like you're paying off a debt," he said, voice low and gravelly, not harsh. "Act like you belong here." Tessa paused, didn't look at him, but her fingers closed slowly around the gloves. She said nothing, offered no thanks, but something small and almost invisible shifted in her eyes. Not softness, but recognition. For the first time in a long time, someone hadn't claimed her. They'd received her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That afternoon, Bo sat by the fire cane set aside watching as Tessa split kindling near the barn. Her swings were sharp, practiced. She'd done hard labor before. But today it didn't feel like punishment. It didn't feel like servitude. It was just a task, and that simple as it was enough to make her chest ache. She brought him a mug of coffee, set it down on the table. He looked up surprised. "You didn't have to," he said. "You paid," she replied with a slight shrug, like that explained everything. Bo studied her for a breath longer than needed. "I paid to get you away from McCord," he said slowly. "Not to own you." "What's the difference?" she asked, eyes not quite meeting his. "There's a difference," he said. "At least, to me there is." That night Tessa lay again in the dark, listening to the wind snake under the roof. But this time, she wasn't on edge. She was listening not to protect herself, but to understand. Who was this man? And why in this quiet little house did her chest feel just a little lighter? Just a little. But for someone who'd spent her life in locked rooms and sharp corners, that little felt like a beginning. The days that followed passed like water soaking into dry earth, slow, quiet, but far from meaningless. Tessa worked without needing to be asked. Like every task her hands touched was a way to prove she still existed. Bo didn't stop her, didn't hover. He let her mend fences, oil saddles, light the stove check, the water troughs, never once asking why she worked like someone who belonged there. He simply watched, and sometimes left behind a small item, quiet acknowledgments that she knew what she was doing, and he was grateful. That afternoon, the sun hung low behind the ridge as Tessa brushed the mane of a young colt, learning how to stand still. The soft whickering of the horse, the steady scrape of bristles, and then suddenly a harsh sound tore through the peace. A thud, flesh and bone against hard dirt. She spun around to see Bo on the ground near the trough cane, several steps away. A curse hissed between his teeth, not from pain, but frustration. Frustration with himself. Without waiting for permission, she rushed over, dropping to her knees in the dust. "Don't move," she murmured, one hand bracing his back, the other at his hip. "You're heavier than I thought." Bo winced, but didn't argue. "I don't recall getting any lighter," he said, breathing hard. She didn't answer, just pulled him up slow and steady, not gentle but patient. By the time they reached the porch steps, her shoulders were shaking with the strain, and his hand gripped the railing, trying not to groan as his knee knocked the wood. "Sorry," she muttered, not meeting his eyes. "Didn't break," he replied through gritted teeth. "Just bruised my pride." She stood, fetched water without another word, but when she came back, he was still sitting there, watching her footsteps like they meant something. The next morning, beside the bread and tin of coffee on the table, she found a small slip of paper, Tessa check, feed storage north fence. Not girl, not hey you, not a command, just Tessa. And to her, seeing her name written by someone else's hand, plain, careful, unadorned, was something she'd never had before. She touched the paper gently, then tucked it into her pocket like something worth keeping. That evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, they sat across from each other, not quite familiar but no longer strangers. Tessa cradled a hot tin mug. Bo wiped down an old blacksmith's hammer. She spoke first voice, small but steady. "When I was a kid, I got whipped for correcting the livestock ledger. Rancher said I was getting mouthy, for pointing out he miscounted his own damn cattle." Bo looked up, eyes steady. No judgment. "And were you right?" he asked. "Of course," she smirked. "I'm a damn good counter." "Then he was a damn fool," Bo said plainly. No pity, no soft landing, just truth. She let out a laugh, short, dry, but real. The first since stepping onto this land. He looked at her, and for the first time said quietly, "Tess." She looked up, and something flickered in her eyes. Not resistance, not correction. She let it hang there. Tess. A name trimmed down, softened, like a hot stone dropped in cold water. "No one's ever called me that," she said later. "They usually just yelled." "I don't yell," he replied, and his eyes met hers like a promise. From that moment on, the space between them didn't close in any obvious way. No words were said about it, but in the way she set his coffee closer to his hand, in the way he never entered the kitchen without tapping his cane lightly. First, there was an unspoken respect passed between them. She never called him boss, never bowed her head. But when Bo stepped into the barn and saw her calming a frightened horse, he understood this woman was no longer a thing bought in a saloon. She was becoming who she truly was not, because of what anyone called her, but because of how he stood beside her, without touching, without claiming, just being there. And to Tessa, no, to Tess, that meant more than love ever had. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't have to become someone else just to be accepted. The night wind slipped through the cracks in the attic boards, whispering like a wordless song. The fire downstairs flickered softly, casting wavering shadows on the ceiling, moving with each quiet breath of the coals below. Tessa lay on her side on the hard mattress, arm tucked beneath her cheek, her back to the stairs, same as every night. But this time her eyes weren't closed. She was used to silence. But for the first time, it felt comforting. Not like the silence after a beating. Not like the silence of curling up in a horse stall listening for heavy boots drawing near. This quiet wasn't lurking. It wasn't waiting to strike. It simply was like morning dew resting on grass. Harmless. Then came the creak of a chair from the kitchen below, the soft clink of a ladle against a tin cup. Tessa sat up, wrapped her blanket around her, and made her way downstairs. Bo sat by the fireplace, legs stretched out, his cane leaning beside the chair. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, saying nothing when she approached, just pushed one toward the empty chair beside him. She sat cradling the mug for warmth, eyes drawn to the fire, reaching gently upward like it was trying to warm something old and aching in someone's heart. They didn't speak for a long time. Then, without looking up, she spoke, softly, like she was saying it to herself. "When I was 8, I watched my parents die." Bo didn't react right away, just set his cup down and turned, slightly listening. They were settlers. She went on, her voice steady, like someone who'd chewed on a memory so long it had lost its bite. Honest. Naive. One night 3 men rode up, said they needed water. My father didn't think twice, invited them in. She paused, breathing in, eyes still on the flames. Then I heard the gunshots, the screams. I crawled under the floorboards, my mother's hiding spot for me whenever strange horses came near. I lay still, didn't breathe, and through the cracks I watched my house burn, watched what they did to my mother. Bo said nothing. No questions, no interruptions. I didn't cry, Tessa whispered. Not that night. Not after. A stable hand found me 2 days later, thought I was a boy, because my hair was short and my face was covered in ash. He took me in, fed me, then put me to work. Laundry mucking stalls, killing chickens, cooking, running errands, sunup to sundown. By 13, I could swing an axe. By 16, I knew how to fight off a man who pushed too far. A strong wind rattled the door, but inside, everything held still, like even the house was holding its breath with her. I learned one thing, she said, voice lower now. No one's coming to save you. No parents, no law, no God. If I didn't know how to bite back, I'd be swallowed whole. Bo sat, quiet hands wrapped around his cup, the fire painting soft glows and hard shadows across his face, like mapping all the roads he'd walked. You know what the funniest part is? Tessa turned toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. I still carry a handkerchief my mother gave me. Every time I was hit, run off, or dragged someplace I didn't want to be, I'd stuff it in my pocket, like that little scrap of fabric was enough to remind me I was still human. Bo didn't laugh, didn't sigh. He just nodded, slow, certain, like confirming something that didn't need saying out loud. Tessa looked at that gesture and fell silent. No one hugged her. No one said, "I'm sorry." No empty words about hope or brighter days. But Bo's silence wasn't cold. It was a kind of space she'd never been given, where her story wasn't taken from her or judged. She nodded too, this time her own, barely noticeable. "I appreciate you listening," she whispered like wind across a quiet stream. Bo lifted his cup, took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, then spoke, voice low and steady as earth. Not everyone could stand back up after all that. Tessa looked at him again, longer this time, then turned away. But this time her eyes didn't feel dry. The night was still cold, but something inside her had warmed. Not because of the fire, but because someone had sat with her in the dark, without trying to mend her, without fixing the wound, just being there, until she decided on her own that she would keep going. That morning, the southern wind crawled over the hills, carrying with it the scent of dry earth, scorched grass, and a strange, damp edge of something unnamed. Bo was splitting wood behind the barn when hoofbeats echoed along the main trail. A figure appeared, a man in a gray coat, black felt hat, perfectly shaped leather satchel tucked under one arm, riding a polished horse that walked like it had never touched the dust of the West. Bo set down the axe, wiped his brow, hand tightening around his cane. The man rode up to the porch, then dismounted with the confidence of someone used to taking up space in other people's homes. "Bo Dillon?" he asked, a smile on his lips that never quite reached his eyes. Bo gave a short nod. "And you are Thomas Whitfield, representing First Land and Title Bank Cheyenne office. Just a routine land ownership review." Tessa, who'd been hanging a saddle on the rack outside, paused. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over silently. Whitfield glanced at her brow, slightly raised, but kept a polite tone. "I'll need to see the original deed. There are discrepancies between the city's copy and the local records." Bo tilted his head, ready to retrieve the old paperwork his father had left. But before he could turn, Tessa's voice cut in calm, low, sharp as a needle. "Let me see your paperwork first." Whitfield hesitated. "This is bank business, miss, I can read," she said, holding out her hand. "And I've seen more forged documents than you'd think." He frowned, but finally pulled out a folded sheet from his leather pouch and handed it over like it was bait on a trap. Tessa unfolded it, her eyes moving quickly across the italic print legal notations and the faint red seal in the corner. She looked up, lips tight, and pointed to a line. First Land and Title changed their letterhead design 3 years ago. They don't use this border anymore. And that clause 14C at the bottom. That's a forfeiture clause tied to hidden loan agreements. This ranch never took a loan. Right Bobo stood still, his shoulders just barely tensing. Right, he said. My father left it to me outright. No debts. Whitfield's smile fell. His tone sharpened. Where'd you learn law? I was at a ranch that lost everything to papers like this, she said, her eyes cutting sharp. I was just the laundry girl, but I read every word. The owner drank himself to death a year later, out of shame. Silence pressed down on the porch like a held breath. Whitfield took the paper back, face stiffening like dried plaster. I'm just doing my job. No. Tessa replied. You're making a living off folks who can't read. But today, you met the wrong one. He glanced at Bo, then turned back toward his horse, snapping. When this land rots beneath you, don't say no one warned you. Tessa didn't answer. She stood tall, arms crossed like a gate no one could walk through. Whitfield rode off the road, kicking up a long, angry trail of dust behind him. Bo turned to her, then his expression more than surprise. It held a quiet, deep acknowledgement. How'd you know all that, he asked. She watched the dust settle, her voice soft but steady. I never forgot the words they used. I lived because they didn't think I mattered. But I listened, and I remembered everything. Bo nodded slow, the way he always did when no words felt worthy. You're smarter than anyone who's ever set foot on this ranch. Tessa let out a short, dry laugh, half amused, half shy. People used to call me a loud, troublesome, untrainable girl. Bo looked at her eyes warm as lanterns in late-day light. Well, he said, they were wrong. In that moment, no one mentioned the bank again. But in Bo's gaze, in the way his hand lingered on the porch rail, in the way his eyes followed her, as she turned away, something shifted. Not because Tessa had saved the ranch, but because he knew if anyone was going to keep this land standing, and keep him standing too, it was her. Hair tousled in the wind, sunlight catching on her cheek, proud, and not needing anyone's permission to belong. That morning, gray clouds blanketed the sky like a heavy quilt laid across the land, muffling every sound. No hammering, no horses whinnying, only the soft rustle of wind through dew-wet grass and the quiet steps of Tessa as she walked through the old wooden gate, a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder, eyes fixed ahead, never once looking back. She had woken earlier than usual, tidied the kitchen, stoked the stove, and left a folded note beside Bo's morning coffee mug. 4 words. Thank you for letting me survive. No signature. No goodbye. Because she didn't know how to say goodbye. She only knew how to leave silent, swift, clean before someone else could shove her out first. Her feet took her to the small creek where she often went to be alone. The water slid softly over stones glinting beneath a dull sky. She set her bag down, sat on the flat rock she always claimed, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't cry. She'd never been the crying kind. But something in her chest twisted tight, a hollow ache, like even the earth beneath her was once again rejecting her presence. Then came hoofbeats on the ridge. She knew it was him before she even looked. Tall, broad-shouldered, that familiar uneven stride as he stepped down from the horse. Bo Dillon. He stood there a long moment without speaking, just watching her like a man trying to measure what holds a person in place and what drives them to leave. Then he walked toward her, slow and steady. He didn't ask why she was there, didn't scold her for leaving without a word. He just stopped beside her, reached into the pocket of his worn coat, and held something out. A square of fabric frayed at the edges. Blue thread faded around hand-stitched corners. Tessa stared at it, breath catching in her throat. That's, she whispered. You left it under the stairs, Bo said quietly, voice low, but not heavy. I almost threw it out. But then, I didn't. Why, she asked, barely audible. Bo met her eyes. They didn't shine. They didn't burn. They were just steady like soil that had never lied. Because I knew one day, You'd need to be reminded you didn't just pass through this place." Tessa lowered her gaze, fingers trembling as she took the handkerchief, the only thing she had left from her mother. Something she thought she'd lost forever in the chaos of those first days on the ranch. She held it against her chest, as if it were her very heart. "I thought I was just passing through," she murmured. "Someone who helps then moves on. I've never stayed anywhere long." Bo didn't rush to speak, didn't deny it, didn't offer soft words. He simply extended a hand open, not grabbing, not pulling, just offered, with the same patient calm he used on the wildest, most stubborn horses. "I'm not making promises," he said. "Just, if you want to stay, not for work, not out of debt, but because this is somewhere you might finally grow roots." Tessa looked at his hand, rough calloused, then to his face so familiar now the way his brows dipped when he was deep in thought, the sun lines etched around his eyes from too many long days, and not enough rest. This man had never made grand gestures. He'd just been there when she fell, when she stayed silent, when she needed someone who'd listen without pity. She placed her hand in his, a hand just as rough, torn by ropes, axes, years of labor. And she held on. Not tight, just enough to say, "I'm here." Bo didn't smile, just nodded the way two people do when they understand each other without needing words. Tessa breathed in deeply. The scent of damp grass and cold stream filled her lungs. For the first time, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt chosen not for being soft, not for being small, but for surviving the storms and keeping her fire lit. And the man beside her, he didn't want to extinguish that fire. He just wanted to sit beside it and warm his hands. In that moment, there were no vows, no church bells, no witnesses. Just the creak, her mother's handkerchief, and two hands touching. But to Tessa, it was the first time she'd ever truly stayed, not because there was nowhere left to go, but because finally there was a place that had chosen her. Summer came slow, as if the land needed to be sure everything was ready to receive the light. On the southern slope, the first blossoms pushed their way through the rocky soil, soft lavender, pale blue forget-me-nots, and gentle yellow wild daisies. The seeds Tessa had planted back when winter still refused to let go were now blooming like her heart, once parched and closed, now beginning to believe in life again. The ranch was no longer just a shelter for two survivors. It had become something steadier, not declared, not wrapped in promises, but real in every small act, the way Bo reached for a coil of rope before she asked, the way she placed his coffee in front of him. Each morning, steam still rising, no reminders needed. People in town started calling the place Wildflower Ridge, no longer Bo Dillon's place. Everyone could see it. Tessa ran things now. She rode out every morning to check the fences, a coiled whip at her saddle, her sun-faded shirt fluttering in the wind. She named every calf, remembered which patch of earth needed water, even tightened bolts on wagons the hired hands had forgotten. When someone asked Bo about it, he just shrugged with a smile. She remembers better than I do. No one dared call Tessa that wild girl anymore. No one whispered about the day she'd been sold like a thing. She didn't need to explain herself. She worked. She was present, like a quiet force everyone respected without being told to. The young men in town, every time they saw her riding by hooves, pounding like thunderhair flying, like fire, tipped their hats with a grin. "Miss Tess," they'd say. Sometimes adding, half teasing, half awed, "the one who rides like a storm." Bo just smiled at that. He'd never called her his. She'd never once claimed to be his wife. But when he stood on the porch and saw her riding across the fields, back straight, reins steady, like she was born to belong to saddle and sky, he knew she was a root that couldn't be pulled, a wildflower growing through stone, a thing even the driest earth couldn't deny. One evening, as dusk folded over the hills, they sat behind the barn, the scent of hay and fading fire mixing in the air. Bo lit his pipe. Tessa stitched a worn saddle strap. They didn't speak, but there was something clear between them, like the wind that passed. No one had to stay anymore. They simply did because they belonged here, and to each other. "You ever think," Tessa said, voice soft as the season's first bird song, "we don't need anything more. No wedding, no paper. Bo nodded, exhaling a slow breath of smoke. "Don't need it," he said. "Just need you here in the mornings. And you knowing you can call this place home." She didn't answer right away. But when she finished the last stitch, she placed her hand over his, not gripping, not holding, just a quiet, steady touch. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. No smiles. But in their hearts, they both understood happiness doesn't come like thunder. It arrives like a gentle breeze moving slowly through all the places that had long gone dry. The next day, when she returned from checking the western fence line, Bo was waiting on the porch with a notebook on his lap. "Crop ledger?" she asked, climbing the steps. He shook his head and opened it. Inside was his rough, careful handwriting. Wildflower Ridge, next season's planting list. Beneath it, a list of all the flowers she'd ever mentioned, ever tried, ever doubted, would survive, now blooming bright across their land. Tessa stared at it for a moment, then looked up. "You really gonna plant all of these?" Bo shrugged. "If anyone can make them grow, it's you." She didn't say anything more, just sat beside him, leaned her shoulder against his. No words, nothing else needed. And in the wide-open sky in front of them, rows of flowers danced gently in the wind. On land that was once dry and hard, something had finally taken root, not just flowers, but a love that never needed to be tamed. A love that chose to grow slowly in wind through stone between two people who once believed they'd never be allowed to stay. Here is the English-American translation of your final emotionally resonant piece. In the last light of summer, Bo and Tessa stood on the ridge where rocks had long since given way to a sea of wildflowers spread out like a woven blanket across the earth. No one could say exactly when the place became known as Wildflower Ridge. Maybe it started with the first blossoms that pushed through the gravel. Maybe it was when folks in town began whispering about Miss Tess, the one who rides like thunder but makes the land bloom. But one thing was certain. It was no longer a stopover for a crippled man and a girl once sold like livestock. It was a home for two people who had been alone broken, and now no longer needed armor just to be near each other. They never signed a marriage license. No rings were exchanged. But every day, Bo greeted Tess coming in from the field with a warm cup of coffee, and every morning Tess slipped a handwritten note into the pocket of his coat. Sometimes just a line. "There's a new calf by the south fence." Or "Don't forget your scarf tonight, the wind's turning." Small things, but string enough of them together, and you've got a life. And if you're reading this right now, feel a quiet ache in your chest, or the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of your mouth, then maybe you're like me. You believe in a kind of love that doesn't shout, doesn't command, just shows up honest. Steady, a shoulder that doesn't flinch when you lean in. Wildmercyrides doesn't tell fairy tales. This is the American West, where the ground is hard, the people harder, and anything soft only survives if it's stubborn enough to keep growing. Here love isn't a rescue, it's a choice. It's built through firewood fence posts, milking cows, and holding hands, when there's nothing left to say, but I'm here. Tessa was once the kind of girl no one could hold on to. They called her wild, difficult, too much. Bo didn't call her anything. He just held out his hand. And in a world where women like Tessa are so often broken, cast off and forgotten, a man who doesn't try to extinguish her fire but stands beside her, letting her burn in her own way, that's nothing short of a miracle. If you've ever been called too much, too different, or too hard to love, this story is for you. If you've ever felt like you only belonged in the margins of someone else's life, look again at Tessa, once armed with nothing but her mother's old handkerchief, now standing strong on the land she calls her own, with hundreds of flowers growing beneath her step. And Bo, not a hero with silver guns and slogans, but the rare kind of man who doesn't speak loud or love loud, just lights the fire and leaves the door open. He's proof that sometimes loving someone isn't about claiming them. It's about making space for them until they're ready to stay. So now the question is yours. What do you want to see next for Tessa and Bo? Their first winter together, children with their mother's fire and father's quiet strength. Or a new trial one that tests what they've built and asks them to rise again for something they've chosen. Leave a comment. Share the story. Let us know you're here. Because Wildflower Ridge isn't just a place on a map. It's a dream we hold on to, even when the world makes it hard to keep believing. And if your heart beats a little faster every time Bo holds out his hand, not to pull Tessa back, but simply to be there, if she chooses to take it, then welcome to our community. Follow the channel. Send this story to someone you know is still waiting for a hand like that. And most of all, never apologize for being yourself, whether you're wild scarred or never quite fit anywhere else. Because out here in the West, you don't have to be tamed to be loved. You just have to find the right person and the right place to live true. And maybe, like Tessa, you're already on the road to somewhere that's been waiting quietly for you all along. A ridge full of flowers, a house with the door left open, and someone not promising anything except to always be there.